I began to look at Cubism in my last lecture, and now I'm going to return to the Demoiselles d'Avignon to look at more examples of this genre. In this, I've combined two summary slides, but it's easier to understand Cubism by looking at Cubist art. So I've already mentioned the influence of African art on expressionist painters such as Duran and Matisse. In this painting, the mask motif should be clear. And by the way, Picasso was also influenced by ancient Iberian sculptures, which were on display at the time he was working on the statue. But at any rate, you should also be able to see the distortion, the flattened space, the fragmented bodies, the black lines used as grid or scaffolding. Again, all those features of Cubism. After the brilliant colors of the Expressionists, sometimes bright and pure, sometimes harsh and jarring, we now encounter a much more limited palette, pinks, grays, blues, browns, a deliberate refusal to use color for contrast. Actually, art historians debate whether Demoiselles d'Avignon is an expressionist work or the first Cubist painting. Note that I've stuck it in both lectures. Note, too, that the composition, like compositions we've seen by Cézanne, Matisse, is filled with contradictory points of view, and it really takes it to a new level. Picasso is deliberately disorienting the viewer. So, for example, we look down at the table at the bottom of the canvas, but we encounter the nudes head on. We see the eyes full face, we see the noses in profile. The seated figure on the lower right faces her colleagues, but manages to turn her head 180 degrees to look at us. Don't try that at home. But whether or not this was a Cubist painting, Demoiselles d'Avignon clearly sparked a major new artistic movement. Cubism itself broke into at least two phases, which I'll talk about. But first, let's hear Sister Wendy's take on this famous painting and the art that it spawned. You're going to hear more from Sister Wendy in the near future, but not as much or for as long as I'd really like. I am skipping 4 wonderful segments of her tour of early 20th century art. These are segments on Cézanne, on Picasso's women, real and painted, on Matisse, and on Kandinsky. You do not have to skip these video segments because I've tube chopped them, and here they are, and you can find them on Moodle. There's no study guide, no quizzes, they're not required, but I think she has wonderful insights, and you'll see some paintings that you won't otherwise see. I especially love Matisse's portrait of a North African. I hope I've tempted you. Anyway, on to analytical cubism. We've already seen a move toward abstraction in art. In the case of Kandinsky, we've really already arrived at abstract art. But it's important to understand, and there's so many philosophical concepts here, I think this can get very confusing. And the way the artists talk in sort of highfalutin language doesn't necessarily make it any easier. But understand that artists had different reasons for creating abstract art. This is a gross generalization, but one group of artists, such as Kandinsky and Mondrian, whom we'll see later, were seeking a kind of spiritual transcendence. They were really trying to escape from the material world into a deeper underlying reality. But especially early in the 20th century, more abstract artists were not so much escaping the material world as trying to distill its essential qualities, to capture these qualities in painting and sculpture, and really to train viewers to see the world in a different way. And the Cubists fit into this second category. Cubists themselves, perhaps appropriately, also splinter into different categories and movements. So Cubism began with what's called analytical Cubism, which is really the work of two men, Picasso and Braque, who were friends and collaborators, and sometimes competitors. You've already seen that Picasso in particular was very competitive. Picasso and Braque essentially saw themselves almost in biological terms as dissectors. They were taking shapes apart, looking for their essential components and how these components interact with the negative space around them, the empty spaces. And this distinction between objects and space becomes much more difficult to see in Cubism, and that's quite deliberate. That's part of what they're exploring. That's especially true when you see objects from multiple perspectives, and these artists want you to always be aware that three-dimensional objects are displayed on a two-dimensional surface. In a sense, all Cubist paintings are paintings about paintings. Remember, this is the age of Einstein. Relativistic time and space was all the rage. So here's a very early Cubist painting, just a year after Demoiselles d'Avignon. Picasso is reducing the house and garden to simplified geometric forms, but you can still more or less tell what they are, and he still maintains a color difference between the house and the garden. We see the same elements in this early Cubist painting by Georges Braque. I hope you got to see this Khan Academy podcast. This could almost be a Cézanne. Braque is still moving toward abstraction. So is Picasso. But with this painting, Braque clearly arrives. The objects are broken down much further, and with it the distinction between object and surrounding space. And again, this blurring of positive and negative space is enhanced by the almost monochromatic use of colors, browns, grays, not much color distinction here. Who's the Portuguese? Well, he was a man who played guitar at a bar in Marseille. And notice how Braque asks the viewer to look for familiar shapes. Do you see a guitar? Can you find the face? You can play some interesting games with this painting. But he's also expecting you to read into this what you know about the subject, and his viewers would have known who the Portuguese was. Braque also inserts texts into the painting, and there's a lot of debate about what these texts mean, and all of these, and in the collages that we're about to see. These are not texts we can easily interpret. And maybe the message is simply that we need to read meaning into a painting. It's certainly true that Picasso and Braque believed and said that viewers needed to learn how to read Cubist paintings the same way they'd really learned to read illusionistic paintings that employed linear perspective. And again, Einstein was forcing everyone to rethink time and space. So we've seen that in this period, Picasso and Braque were moving away from bright colors, but not all Cubist artists were. This is Robert Delaunay, and he deliberately used color to capture harmony and dissonance. This is another painter who used musical terms, and in fact, his colorful version of Cubism was labeled Orphism by the poet Apollinaire, by the way. This was named after the Greek god of music. Now, we saw a similar effect in Mark's Fate of Animals, which I've stuck into a corner of this slide, a painting I like very much. It's a work that could probably be labeled either expressionistic or cubist or orphistic. There are too many terms. I find it irritating too, but I didn't invent them, and you may be tested on them, so I'm throwing them in. Here are a couple more examples of Delaunay's work. Again, I'm continuing the pattern of trying to show you more works than the single one that's in your textbook. If you're wondering who Blériot was, I looked it up. He was an aviator, an inventor, and engineer who is credited with inventing car headlights. And I wonder if those are in fact headlights in that painting. It's kind of neat. You can see I like this guy. Here are still more works by Delaunay. You may have noticed I have a weakness for bright colors. On to synthetic cubism. So analytic cubism basically smashed an object to see all of its individual pieces, but kind of left them where they were smashed, more or less. The next stage of cubism, which began in 1912, basically saw Picasso and Braque picking up the pieces and reassembling them to make new objects. That's where the term synthesis comes from, putting together. And one of the ways that they put together was to add found objects, bits of paper, items with texture, and in the process, actually, your textbook says they invented the collage. That's not actually quite accurate. Scrapbooking, as we would call it, already existed. It was largely a pursuit of women, and to some extent, Picasso and Braque were taking that and adapting it to their art. So here's an example of synthetic cubism. This one isn't in your book, but it's one of Picasso's most famous works. There's so many Picasso works I'm not showing you. As I said earlier, 30,000 works, don't have time. But notice that in this painting, it's easier to make out three figures, but if you look more closely, does that middle figure really have a face? Notice too how the ground of the painting shifts from left to right. Essentially the ground line moves. And did you see that there's a dog under the table? Look at that tail. In this painting, by the way, Picasso also embraces brighter colors, which is an element of some synthetic cubist painting. And in fact, here again, Braque is not using as vibrant colors as Picasso did, but you're seeing the reassemblage of items, and also the use of collage items. This is the example of that in your textbook. During the synthetic cubism phase, Picasso and Braque, as I mentioned, began incorporating real objects into their paintings. This is actually a photolithograph pattern of a cane chair seat that was reproduced on oilcloth, and that cloth was then glued onto the canvas. And a rope was glued on as the border. Here are 3 Braque collages with actual newspaper articles glued into the painting, and there's an entire industry of art historians and analysts trying to figure out the significance of these various newspaper articles, and I will tell you that they all seem to have a different theory, so I'm not going to bother. But I just had to include this. Also not in your textbook, but this dates from what is known as Picasso's Rococo Cubist period, when he experimented with bright colors and depictions of jewels. He's actually put colorful enamel on top of oil paint for this. I just love that term, Rococo Cubist. You remember Rococo art, right? You're not going to get Rococo Cubism on your art history test, but I just thought you'd be deprived if you didn't see some. This is actually a sculpture made from sheet metal. But notice that even with this 3-dimensional object, Picasso is still playing with the juxtaposition of 2- and 3-dimensional depictions of space and volume. So while this is abstract still, it comes closer to what we think of as sculpture, in part because it's made of a traditional sculptural material, in this case bronze. Still, you see the Cubist emphasis on reducing objects to planes, or really in this case into geometric, volumetric patterns. I think this sculpture is very interesting. Here are 3 more works. That one on the right apparently is just entitled Sculpture, so your guess is as good as mine. These 2 sculptures illustrate another Cubist obsession with voids or holes, or what art analysts call, I've been using this term, negative space. Notice that the woman on the left has no face, but she has a very evocative face-shaped hole, so we really see a face there. The statue on the right of the same subject seems to be more void than object. Well, brace yourself. I'm going to hit you with one more ism before I close, that we have lots more to come. Some artists, most notably the famous architect Le Corbusier, criticized Cubism. Basically, he argued it was just too cerebral, too brainiac, too out of touch with the realities of modern life, and in particular, too out of touch with the realities of the machine age. We're going to hit the machine age in a big way in my next lecture when we look at futurism and then the Dada rebellion, I would say, against machine guns, really. Purists admired what they saw as the clean, functional lines of modern machines, but they were also fascinated by the way the Cubists dissected objects in space. Leger is the best known of the Purist painters. His work is very distinctive, and I don't think it's impossible that you might be asked to identify a Leger painting. In this, you see he tries to capture the infrastructure and pulsing life of a modern city. You can see the flashing lights, the bridges, workers who seem almost like robot-like automatons. Why machines are pure? Well, I'm not sure, but purism is a good lead into futurism, and that's where I'm going to begin my next lecture. But first, here are some more paintings by Leger. I particularly like the one that's called The Wedding. I've been to some weddings like that.